A secret isn't just a lie, Asya. It's a toxic brick, and you used every single one of them, piece by piece, to build a towering wall right through the middle of this entire family, making us total strangers to one another. Pars's voice did not explode with rage. Instead, it dropped to a lethal, ice-cold, and dangerously deep whisper that could make anyone's soul shudder. His trembling hands gripped an old, faded, and now completely shattered family photo in the frame so tightly that his knuckles turned stark white. A suffocating, ominous silence hung over the room, like the dead quiet that precedes a devastating storm. The only sound echoing through the space was the uneven, trembling, and choked breathing of Asya. The tracks of her tears had already dried and hardened on her cheeks, and she stood frozen in her place, staring at her husband not as the man she loved, but as a ruthless, unyielding judge. Driven by pure desperation and helplessness, Asya took a shaky step forward, her hands trembling in the empty air. She began to weep, begging him from the bottom of her heart to please stop, to just listen to her, because her chest felt like it was breaking apart. She cried that every single member of this house was already enduring such agonizing pain and trauma, that they simply didn't have the strength to bear any more heartbreak. Hearing her words, Pars let out a sharp, bitter, and mocking laugh, a sound dripping with absolute contempt and profound regret. Piercing her eyes with his own, he told her that if every single human being in this house was agonizing today, if they were all weeping in silence, it was solely and entirely because of her. He told her they were all burning to ash, because she chose to harbor Levent's sickness and utter filth in her heart, staying silent day after day, while watching him drag their family through the mud and public humiliation without uttering a single word in their defense. He shook her emotionally, declaring that if such horrific secrets existed while living under the same roof, it meant they were never truly a family in their hearts. They were merely strangers sharing a house. Asya's voice cracked violently under the weight of her internal collapse. Sobbing uncontrollably, she choked out her defense, claiming that her intention was never to betray him or the family, but that she was genuinely trying to shield him from the brutal reality and save the entire household from falling apart. But Pars fixed his sharp, furious, dagger-like gaze onto her face, forcing her to look into the mirror of the past. He reminded her that from the very first night they married, he had always held onto absolute honesty with her, no matter how bitter, ugly, or painful that truth happened to be. He had openly confessed to her that there was someone else in his past, because he refused to build their sacred bond and their future on a quicksand of lies and deception. He knew back then that hearing it would cause her immense grief and break her heart, but hearing the truth directly from her husband's mouth was 1,000 times better than watching her entire world collapse later by finding out from a complete stranger. And that was the exact same catastrophic betrayal Asya had just inflicted on him. She had left him completely alone in the dark, helpless and blind, and the consequence of her silence was devastating. Now, his own flesh and blood, his siblings, looked at him with hatred as if he were their greatest enemy. Falling to her knees, Asya wept bitterly, begging for forgiveness and crying out an admission that she had made a massive, unforgivable, and irreversible mistake that she now fully understood and deeply regretted. But Pars turned his face away in complete disgust and asked in a thunderous, demanding voice, "How am I supposed to fix any of this now, Asya? How do I bring back an old father who is currently fighting for his final breaths on an ICU bed in the hospital? What am I supposed to do about my innocent sister, Nalan, who is forced to live an agonizing, suffocating lie all because of the horror you hid from us? And what becomes of my little sister, Duru, whose hard-earned trust took ages to win, only for you to reduce it to dust in a single, cold-blooded second?" Without even glancing at her face, his voice turned dead and final as he told her to stop offering empty apologies and to never dare cross his path again, because he was trapped in his own darkness, with no idea how to tear down the massive wall of resentment her silence had built between them. Meanwhile, in the far corner of that same grand living room, a strange and sinister wave of tension began to ripple. Ghoul sat quietly in her chair, her fingers nervously yet systematically tracing the edge of her teacup with absolute malice, while Layla paced back and forth in the background, driven mad by pure rage. The heavy sound of Layla's footsteps and her volatile anger vibrated intensely through the very walls of the estate. Ghoul leaned forward slowly, a wicked, unnatural gleam shining in her eyes as she lowered her voice to a manipulative, venomous purr, deliberately pouring poison into Pars's mind. She suggested that perhaps Asya never actually wanted to fix anything, that perhaps deep down in her heart, she took pleasure in watching this entire family bleed, weep, and suffer, finding her own twisted peace in their destruction. Furious and shaken, Pars turned his sharp gaze toward her, demanding to know what she meant by such garbage. It was then that Ghoul dropped a devastating bomb that sent shockwaves through everyone present. She boldly claimed that Nalan was never pregnant to begin with, that the entire pregnancy, the baby, and the joy were nothing but a massive, disgusting fraud. And the ultimate, crushing truth was that Asya knew about this entire charade from day one, consciously choosing to keep him completely blind to the truth. Driven by an explosive mix of rage and shock, Pars slammed his hand onto the table with maximum force, causing the porcelain teacups to rattle violently against each other. He confronted Ghoul, commanding her to look him dead in the eye and warning her never to utter another lie, because Asya would never play such a vile, treacherous game behind his back against his own family. But Ghoul simply smiled, a cold, triumphant, and venomous grin, and replied, "Oh, Pars, you are so incredibly naive. I made one small mistake in my life, and all of you joined hands to throw me out of this house like garbage, exiling me into the cold. Yet this precious Asya of yours betrays you every single day, every single hour, stabbing you straight in the back, and she still gets rewarded with a warm embrace and instant forgiveness. What kind of justice is that?" Before Ghoul could even finish her sentence, Layla completely lost her mind to hatred and fury. She lunged violently toward Asya, reaching out to grab her by the collar, screaming at the top of her lungs that she was a parasite, a witch who was systematically destroying them from the roots, and that they would not tolerate her presence for another second. The chaos reached a boiling point until the grandmother, pushed to her absolute limit, slammed her heavy wooden cane onto the floor with immense power. The booming sound echoed through the high ceilings, causing the entire room to fall dead silent. She commanded everyone to hold their tongues instantly, declaring with absolute authority that no one was going anywhere. Layla, panting with anger, turned to her grandmother and demanded to know if she had completely lost her mind to protect this snake under their roof, reminding her that just 5 minutes ago, she herself had ordered Asya to pack her bags and get out. The grandmother stood her ground, stating firmly that Pars had the final, absolute word in this house because his father was completely incapacitated in the hospital. This meant Pars was now the official patriarch and head of the estate, and whatever decision he made, every single person would bow to it. Layla spat back with pure defiance, declaring that she answered to absolutely no one. Pars was not her father, and she would not submit to him. She screamed that if this manipulative outsider had simply spoken up about Levent's vile actions from the start, their family wouldn't be shattered into pieces today. Meanwhile, across town in a sleek, high-rise luxury apartment, a completely different panic was unfolding. A smartphone on a glass desk was ringing relentlessly, with urgent calls from the corporate headquarters. Investors were sitting anxiously in a secure boardroom, waiting to sign a multi-million-dollar corporate merger. Yaman was desperately pacing around the room, trying his best to stall the executives over text, entirely unaware of the catastrophic trauma and emotional warfare taking place back at the main family estate. Just as the arguments inside the mansion reached a fever pitch, the massive double doors of the estate flew open with a violent crash. Levent stood on the threshold, breathless, drenched in sweat, his clothes disheveled, and his eyes wide with a genuine, paralyzing terror. Layla glared at him with pure disgust, telling him to save his pathetic breath if he was there to beg for mercy. because she was on her way to tell Nalan every single detail of his treachery today. But Levent gasped for air, his voice cracking as he screamed, "You don't understand! None of you understand. Savaş just took her. Savaş kidnapped Nalan straight out of her hospital room." A collective shock paralyzed the room, and Asya let out a horrified gasp, her hand rushing to her mouth. The grandmother stepped forward, her face turning completely pale as she shook her head, refusing to believe the nightmare. She argued that even in the darkest, most ruthless blood feuds, there are sacred lines that are never crossed. You never touch the women of the family. To do so would ignite an all-out, unstoppable war that Savaş could never hope to contain, and he would never dare risk that kind of mutual destruction. Layla screamed at her, declaring that this was no trick, that Savaş had been terrorizing their household for weeks. And while they all sat around debating ancient family honor and outdated codes, her sister was gone, and their entire legacy was crumbling to ash. As the shouting escalated, Asya looked down at her vibrating phone, her face completely drained of color as she scrolled. A massive leak had just hit the internet. A relentless string of private, highly sensitive family photos and dark secrets was popping up on her feed in real time. The digital annihilation of their family name was officially complete. Pars stood frozen for a fraction of a second, staring into the abyss of his ruined life. Then he grabbed his heavy leather jacket. His voice was entirely dead, devoid of emotion, cold and absolute as he looked at the room and ordered, "Get in the car. The time for talking is over." Without waiting for a response or looking back even once, he turned and walked out into the pouring, relentless rain, leaving the massive front doors of the mansion swinging wide open behind him, letting the cold storm consume the house.